Hello there. Let's talk about some lab environment options you can use to build yourself a Linux lab environment. Because as I said in the previous video, one of the best ways to learn Linux is to play with it. So the main options you have, go and get your hands on a second computer. Either you have a spare computer laying around, you've purchased a second-hand computer from whatever second-hand purchasing platform you want to use, whether it be Craigslist, Facebook Marketplace, or anything else. Or you've gone for a refurbished computer. Now, if you do go for this option, I would suggest something like a Lenovo ThinkPad would be a pretty good option, especially because there is a sort of cult following with old ThinkPads running Linux right now. That does drive the price up, but it is worth the premium because it's a reliable machine from a business environment, so it's probably got many good years left in it still. And Linux does run pretty smoothly, as Lenovo and Dell are both OEMs that can install Linux on the machines for you. Please note that was not a free promotion for either of the two brands. Then you could look at dual booting, where you set up your computer to dual boot between your current OS and Linux. I'm not encouraging this because it can affect the primary computer that you use all the time. I'd rather something you use for a lab environment is not going to affect your ability to operate your main daily driving computer in any negative way. So rather, if you're going to try and use your main computer, go for a virtual machine, if your main computer is capable of running a VM. Thankfully though, most computers nowadays are pretty respectable and capable of running a VM, albeit with very limited resources, but it is an option. Then you could look at cloud hosting a Linux VM. You will run into some limitations, but it could be a pretty cool option where if you don't have a second computer, you're unable to run a VM on your current computer, and you're nervous about replacing whatever operating system you're currently using with Linux, could be a good option. But it could incur some costs, but we're going to break all these pros and cons down now. And lastly, you could replace your main operating system on your main primary computer with Linux. I'm not encouraging this because, again, I don't want something that's going to possibly make your main computer unusable to you. So let's run through the main options that I sort of encourage. The first one is to get a second computer. So let's look at the pros. You're going to have direct hardware access, which means Linux is going to be able to run more fluidly and smoothly. And you're also going to be able to do some things with some distros that are just not possible when Linux is running in any sort of emulated or virtualized environment. It's also going to be the most realistic in terms of getting some commands to do what they're meant to do, especially commands that deal with hardware and drivers. And it could be the starting point of a home lab for you if you have not already got one going. And to me, the main advantage is this is going to give you less risk and issues with your main computing environment. So whatever it is you use for doing what you do, whether it be browsing the web, playing games, doing work, whatever, it's going to have minimal risk to you. But there are some cons here, obviously. And that first one is it requires a separate computer, which may end up costing you money if you have not got one laying around already. And if you do go for a second-hand or refurbished machine, you might run into some hardware limitations of older equipment. Now, yes, Linux does run smoothly on older machines, but some of the more popular distros that have got a lot of nice fancy new features are starting to expect a bit more out of the hardware than in previous years. So you might have to use a lesser known distro that might be a bit old and outdated if you are going to be using older hardware. The cool thing is it costs you nothing to experiment with different distros besides your time and effort to actually just go and replace the distro on a machine. Now, dual booting, although I'm not a big fan of it, it is a good option where you can have direct hardware access and have Linux share the computer with another OS. So the pros, again, direct hardware access and more realistic, just like you get with the separate computer. It won't incur any additional costs either. So that's a nice advantage. You've already got the current computer, I'm assuming. The con? Linux's bootloader will replace whatever bootloader you currently have for your current OS. And not all Linux distros are easy to set up in a dual boot mode. Some are very cool. During the installation process, the wizard will actually detect the presence of another OS and default to installing alongside whatever you've already got. Others might require a bit more effort and time out of you to get it up and running. But the catch is you can only ever boot to one of those two OSs at a time. Now, my big concern for you is the fact that Linux's bootloader called Grub will replace whatever you currently have, whether it be like a Windows bootloader or a Mac OS bootloader. And if you want to remove Linux, you're going to have to reinstate the other operating system's bootloader. It can give you more headaches than it's worth. It might be easier in the long run to either get yourself a separate computer or go for a virtual machine. And the pros of a virtual machine is it can be very cost effective potentially if your computer already has a good CPU and a healthy amount of RAM. And it's also very convenient. You can set up, install, and test out a Linux distro in a VM very, very quickly. And when you want to try out a different one, it can be pretty easy to swap between Linux distros. And if anything does go wrong, it's pretty easy to recover or restore a VM. Now, don't get me wrong, you could still troubleshoot whatever went wrong to try and give yourself that practice and experience. But if it's one of those kinds of problems where it's going to take you forever to fix and it's just slowing your learning process down, you can quickly revert back or rebuild yourself a new VM. But obviously there are going to be cons. First of all, virtualization is resource intensive. So you're going to have a good CPU, healthy amount of RAM, and be prepared for the heavier power draw and your computer running hotter. And whatever resources your computer has, that's the performance limitations you're going to run into. It's going to impose a maximum limit, mainly from RAM, but also storage as well. CPUs aren't too much of an issue nowadays, as most hypervisors don't do CPU affinity. They use whichever CPU core is currently available. And some operations are going to work better with direct hardware access, so you're going to lose a little bit of the realism, especially with commands that deal with hardware and drivers and managing those things. And virtualization can potentially add extra layers of complexity and obfuscate certain things from you, which, like I said, makes hardware management a little bit more difficult and can also make some of the advanced networking features of Linux a bit harder to experiment with. But just starting out, I think a virtual machine would be a great option for most of you. Alternatively, you could look at cloud hosting, where somebody else runs the VM for you, basically. So the pros of cloud hosting is it's going to be very, very accessible for the simple reason you just need the internet and a cloud provider with an account on their platform, and off you go. And there's going to be no hardware requirements out of you apart from a computer that needs to connect to the internet. But there are going to be some catches and cons, obviously. First of which is cost. A lot of cloud providers don't do much for free anymore, so you're going to have the direct cost of running a VM. But there's also going to be hidden costs as well. For instance, if you forget to shut down a virtual instance in the cloud and you're paying to run that thing, it's going to keep racking up the bill while it runs. And if you make a mistake, like starting off a process that doesn't terminate or doesn't get ended when you log out of your machine, it's going to drive up costs. There are so many interesting little ways that hidden costs can creep in with a cloud hosted solution, so you want to be very careful with that. Especially as most cloud service providers do expect some sort of payment details, like a credit card or a debit card, to be added when you're signing up for an account, even if you are only planning to use the free tier of performance. It's very, very easy to slip into a paid-for tier. And there's very little hardware interaction, so you can pretty much forget most of the hardware exercises. And again, performance limitations could cause a problem for you. Now, I have played with Linux in a couple of cloud service provider environments, and often if I deploy it, it's going to be done as a template, and usually it'll be a Linux server with no GUI by default, which shouldn't be a big issue, but for newcomers, it is a bit intimidating to deal with a purely command line only operating system. Thankfully, though, Linux does have desktop environments or graphical user interfaces, as you're probably more familiar with. And you're also going to be reliant on whatever the cloud service provider allows you to do. Now that means a few things. First of all, what Linux distros you're allowed to run, and exactly what type of resources and uses you can do with it. It could also be governed and restricted by a cloud service provider. It all depends on which one you've gone for. But through a little bit of digging around, I have found a free option on instantworkstation.com. You can go and check that out. You can run a workstation for free. The only thing is, nothing you do is persistent. If you want persistence, you create an account and you pay for it. So you can experiment there. But if any of you have come across a pretty good free solution with little to no strings attached, please pop it down in the comments below so that I can check it out. And if they're any good, I will make a pinned comment listing off all of the community suggestions. Otherwise, that's the main options you have. My preference would be a VM first and foremost, then maybe a separate computer, and thereafter you could consider maybe dual booting or running it as your main operating system. Now, I would say while learning for the first time, run a VM or run it on a separate computer. Dual booting, once you're familiar and comfortable, because then you can have whatever operating system you're already familiar with and Linux available to you on the same computer at the same time. And then in the cloud, well, if that does happen to work out well for you, fantastic. If not, skip over it. Otherwise though, hopefully that was helpful to you all. I'd like to say thank you for watching. If you have anybody that you know that would like to learn Linux and potentially get the CompTIA Linux Plus or LPIC-1 certification, don't be afraid to share this video with them. And in the next video, I'm going to demonstrate to you how to install Linux in various hypervisors for running Linux as a VM, as I think that'll probably be the most accessible to most of you. Otherwise though, I'll catch you in the next video.